Hi everyone. A while back I made a video on the Taiwanese Green Island violin. I got a lot of comments back on that one, a lot of people reaching out. It was nice to be able to share that story because I'm half Taiwanese and I have a lot of good memories in Taiwan. I know a lot of good Taiwanese people. And from that video I was put in touch with a workshop in Taiwan who wanted to send me 2 violins and have my thoughts. So that in itself was a bit harrowing, sending 2 instruments from Taiwan to New York in the depths of December. Taiwan is a subtropical climate and we were in the middle of a snowstorm at the time, so the last thing I wanted was for the instruments to turn up when I wasn't at home and be sitting on our doorstep in the snow, and it makes me cringe even thinking about it. But luckily that didn't turn out to be the case. I was there, got to nab them straight away. It's always been really interesting meeting different people through our concerts and YouTube channel and just through our work. And this was no different. So these 2 violins, which I'll show you in a second, come from the workshop of Rock Huang, who worked and studied in the workshop of Su Ding Shuang, one of the first, if not the first, violin maker in Taiwan. What sparked my attention and sets these instruments apart is the fact that Huang uses natural lacquer instead of the much more common varnish on these instruments. So this technique was pioneered by Su, who is now in his 80s and retired. Huang now continues to create instruments with these same methods. When they first mentioned this to me, using lacquer instead of varnish, my first reaction was, oh, that's cool, but let me play it. Let me see how this feels. Let's get to the meat of the instrument, because lacquer and varnish, they're basically the same thing, right? Wrong. When I mentioned about this to my luthier friends, they were shocked and very curious. So I knew I had to do some digging and research to learn a little bit more about this. Now, I did want to take a little side note for a second to talk about one of the most common comments I get on the channel. And it's usually along the lines of, hey, crazy violin lady, stop touching the varnish, it damages it. And I just like to address that for 1 second. You're totally right. It damages it. The more you touch the varnish, the more the natural oils on your hands work to slowly corrode it. Not to mention the sweat that inevitably turns up when you're playing on it every day, not to mention a very hot day. So it's true, touching varnish does absolutely degrade and damage it. And if the instrument is being kept in a collection and not being touched, that's the best way to preserve its integrity. And maybe we musicians are a little too careless about it, but you tell me this, how on earth are you supposed to play your instrument, let alone develop a close relationship with it without the casual touch over the back, swiping the extra buildup of rosin with the pad of your thumb, any of those things? I've watched my teachers over the years with their own adored instruments. They're all expensive, exquisite things that they picked up decades ago at much cheaper rates than we'd ever dream of today. And I'm not saying it's right, because it's not, but I've seen them scotch tape, I've seen them use foam pads held together with rubber cement, you name it. They're holding these little bits of instruments together, and these are huge competition winners I'm talking about. It's not right, and I don't personally do things like that, but we do have to all be a little bit more realistic about the way we treat our instruments, the way we make relationships with them. They're not in a museum. They are working instruments, doing in its true platonic fashion exactly what they were built for, not as artwork, but to create music. Okay, so that's off my chest. A little philosophy stuck in there. So let's get back to it. The first question is naturally, seriously, varnish? So what does that have to do with anything when you're making a violin other than to make it pretty at the end? And as it turns out, the varnish can really impact an instrument's sound, affecting how the wood vibrates and resonates. While the shape of the instrument and the finesse of the woodworking has the greatest impact on the sound, the varnish is like a last subtle touch that can affect the tone quality, the warmth of the tone, the projection, or the clarity of the sound. So a good varnish can enhance the natural tone qualities of an instrument, but a bad varnish can actually dampen those same qualities. There are 2 types of varnishes that are used on violins: oil varnishes and spirit or alcohol varnishes. And this video will be also looking at natural lacquer, which is what these 2 instruments have been coated with. So oil varnish is at its most basic oil cooked with resin, which results in a darker colored liquid that becomes more transparent over time. You rest it for a few months to polymerize, allowing the smaller molecules, monomers, to bind together to form larger molecules, polymers. And then you separate it into smaller quantities and color it. It's pretty volatile stuff to cook up. You're fusing this stuff together with heat, often including materials like amber, copal, or sandarac for specific coloring. So think about it. You get it in really hot oil. You get really hot. It's not something you want to be doing in the house in the 1700s. It's super flammable, it's unstable, and it's noxious. You need a good open space to cook it up in. Even a closed city backyard, it's not enough. So here's an excerpt from a letter from Nicolas Lupeau to François-Louis Pic, very well-known luthiers, contemporaries, and friends living in Paris. He says, "I beg you, if you can do me the favor at this time to have some of your oil varnish for a few violins, I being short in this time and not having the time to make it. I made some 4 years ago that I used up until this time. However, in Paris, it is not very convenient to do this. We would need a yard or garden for the process. As I have 2 violins to varnish immediately, I would be obliged if you would send me this in a small bottle with Roquefort, annatto, to put before the ground coat of saffron. I am not in a particular hurry for the 2 violins that I mentioned." And so what this is telling us, especially when we look at their dates, which is interesting. So Lupeau is 1758 to 1824. Pic is 1758 to 1822. They're born in the same year, died 2 years apart. Close friends. They were making their instruments in Paris, smack in the middle of the reign of terror through the Napoleonic era. So business continues as usual, but it's very difficult to get out into the country at the moment and cook yourself up some varnish. Now, spirit varnish, on the other hand, varies greatly. From the very cheapest stuff you can get at Home Depot, which comes with a red tint straight away, or you can make your own. The alcohol is the solvent for the resins in this case. And since alcohol is pretty volatile as it is, you don't need to cook it like you do with an oil varnish. When you apply heat to the oil and resin, it will gradually break down and create its own chemical reaction. Whereas with alcohol, you don't need heat to create this reaction. An alcohol varnish then needs to be just given a good shake and filtered. It's way, way easier to make and easier to work with since it dries quickly. There is a lot of argument as to which varnish is better for the sound, with there being no real conclusive answer. That being said, it seems like luthiers tend to lean towards oil over spirit when they build, with the thinking being that oil varnish tends to be more flexible, which allows better vibration and a richer, fuller sound. They also tend to be more durable and less likely to crack over time. Remember that, because flexibility and durability, that's gonna come again. So remember, spirit varnishes, on the other hand, they can dry quickly and supposedly enhance the clarity, but they don't age as well and can over time create a harder, more edgy sound. Also, a spirit varnish doesn't need to have a barrier from the wood of the instrument. So let me explain this. If you think about wood, the material is porous, soaks things up. When you apply an alcohol-based varnish, the alcohol evaporates quickly, which prevents it from soaking too deep into the wood. On the other hand, an oil varnish needs a barrier to be applied first, because otherwise the oil would soak straight into the wood. This would make the wood more supple, and when it's exposed to oxygen, it oxidizes and hardens, which also makes a really nice finish. But that's not necessarily the best thing for the sound. However, every single one of the big luthiers from Italy from way back when would use this barrier, also known as a ground. There is a lot of research going into the use of these grounds, which is in itself super interesting. So there are a ton of options out there, from ready-made grounds like the balsam ground, which seems to be a really lovely one that's being used at the Chicago School of Violin Making, or you can buy it online, or recipes like plaster of Paris, or egg whites, propolis, hide glue, and a ton of other natural materials. It's been speculated that the idea of grounds first came into play in the late 1600s. It's still not clear exactly which protein was used, but the same one is said to have been used on Guadagninis, Stradivarius, and Guarneris. And if you are still trying to visualize what exactly it is I'm talking about with grounds, imagine an instrument from the classical era. Now, think of every time you shift, how your palm rubs up against the shoulder of the instrument and wears down that varnish. What you see underneath that worn down varnish, that is the ground. This is, by the way, a pretty beat up 1755 Gabriele that was made in Florence and I've had since I was 12. And yes, it does need a lot of work. Incidentally, it's fascinating how much research and speculation has gone into Stradivari's varnishes as well as his ground. Taking a bit of a dive into it reveals that there are many papers written on the subject, and the Harris-Sheldon paper has apparently gone the farthest, even recreating Stradivari's ground. There also seems to be some agreement that the ground layer is what contributes most to the tonal properties of Stradivari's instruments and why people have been trying to recreate it. So it looks like the most abundant particles to be detected are calcite, potassium feldspar, gypsum, and quartz. The question is, how did 17th century Italian luthiers manage to crush these powders into such small particles? And the other cool bit, they actually discovered actual flakes of Stradivari's skin in his ground, which shows that he actually was applying it with his thumb, which is very cool. And so what Harris and Sheldon did to recreate the same ground was use a recipe of oil to resin, turpentine, kaolin or china clay, rabbit skin glue, and water. I could get more into the particulars with the percentages, but as I've discovered while talking to my luthier friends, I'm already in way over my head as it is. And speaking of which, just one more fascinating little tidbit. I was talking to Jimmy Dugdale on the phone, who's an excellent luthier in my area, and he mentioned that since he does more restoration work instead of building, he tends to use alcohol-based varnish much more frequently since it allows you to match the existing color with much more precision. He also mentioned that grounds require tanning in the sun and gives you a base color to work over. If you add a color to the ground, it could go on extremely bright, but after an hour in the sun, it really relaxes. So I asked Jimmy, did I hear you right? Stradivari would hang his violins out in the sun? To which he replied, I mean, probably, but do I have proof of that? Absolutely not. So I'm going to take probably. Of course, you can still just hang your violins outside to tan, but it's probably not the most controlled environment. So this is Jimmy's setup. As he puts it, it's his grow tent for cellos. And here are some of the other ways people create UV light boxes for their instruments. So let's get back to the larger topic at hand, using natural lacquer as a varnish for a violin. Does it improve the sound? Suding Xuan and Rock Huang certainly think so, and we're going to learn more about that. And then I'll show you two of Huang's violins in a separate video so you can come to your own conclusions. So the very first thing, what is the difference between lacquer and varnish? Generally, varnish is a resin-based finish that we've been looking at inside and out, and lacquer is solvent-based, and it's very quick to dry. The particular sort of lacquer we're looking at with Su and Huang's violins is natural lacquer, which is harvested straight from lacquer trees, also known as urushi in Japanese. It's a specifically Asian thing, and when you think of the coating on chopsticks, bowls, a lot of furniture, that's what we're talking about. And so this lacquer is tinted, and then it's built up with hundreds of coats of lacquer and then hand carved. So I'm gonna close up this video. I hope you learned a lot about varnishes. I definitely did. I knew nothing about varnish. And in the next video, I'm going to be addressing lacquer, what's used to coat these violins. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give us a thumbs up, shoot us a comment, and make sure to subscribe. Until next time, cheers.